here. So, in the run up to the 2020 election, I kept a lot of focus on my show on politics. And then after the 2020 election, I started unfollowing people who were focused on politics, and I just wanted to diminish the role of politics in my online Twitter diet. I also unfollowed a lot of people who were banging on that COVID was a hoax. So with 3,000 to 5,000 Americans dying every year from COVID, every day from COVID-19, felt like I could do without those perspectives. Then and followed people who were banging on about voter if I after the election, and daily show brings so much as consistently as Scott Adams. So I give him credit, but I was ready to move on after the election. And then there are just other people who I just wanted to take a break from on my Twitter feed. And so as I was logging into Twitter last night after the Sabbath, like the first few posts, it's giving me from Kevin Michael Grace, because there aren't many people, if any, whose posts I've retweeted or liked as much as Kevin Michael Grace. And so I just felt like, I want a different perspective. All right, I'm just gonna unfollow Kevin a little bit, because the Happy New Year, Laponius Maximus. So I thought I just want to get some new stuff into my Twitter feed. I think I'll just unfollow Kevin for a little while, because the Twitter algorithm is just maximizing all his posts, and I just want something different. And it wasn't something deeply thought through when I choose to follow or unfollow someone on Twitter. I don't think of it as making any kind of major statement. I have a very modest following on Twitter, so I just wanted a little something different in my Twitter feed. And then, like, shortly after I unfollowed Kevin on Twitter, he made a post about it. And then all these people piled on, like, speculating, how had Kevin managed to offend me? And there was nothing Kevin did to offend me. There's nothing that I objected to. There's no political, cultural, religious opinion that has offended me in my life. I just wanted a different diet in my Twitter feed. Sometimes I just want to take a break from certain personalities or certain perspectives in my Twitter feed, and that's it. But to see the hurt and the contempt and sometimes the rage and the disgust, simply because I made a small change to my Twitter diet, was amusing, and it just kind of reminds me of like a lot of unnecessary hatred that goes on in life. So I think there's absolutely necessary hatred, right? If you love your family and your family is being threatened, then it makes complete sense to hate those who threaten the safety and well-being of your family. If your people are being threatened, it makes sense to hate those who threaten your people. If your life is threatened, it makes sense to hate those who threaten your life. If your country's survival is at stake, then it makes sense to hate those who threaten your country's survival. But then there's just gratuitous hatred, which I think is just personal dysfunction. And as Laponius commented the other day, when you think you've seen it all with regard to personal dysfunction, then there's always new depths. There's always new depths of dysfunction to plumb. And so on the one hand, I understand people who love their hometown and they have sporting or cultural or political rivalries with, say, another town in their state. So you can understand why they'd have a bit of animus, San Francisco towards LA, Philadelphia towards New York. But then a lot of the animus just seems gratuitous. And I've been moved by this terrific book, The Intellectuals and the Masses, British Intelligentsia from 1880 to 1939, and to see just how much gratuitous hatred people in the intelligentsia had for the great mass of people. It just seems so pointless. Of course, there really isn't such a thing as a mass. It's comprised of individuals. Hey, Katie, Happy New Year. God bless you. And so this idea that the great mass of people are stupid, the great mass of people don't have worth, the great mass of people have really bad taste in literature or culture, just seem really stupid. And then the widespread hatred just seemed completely over the top. And the hatred was directed at things like newspapers. Like anything that's mass-produced must be bad. Like the hatred of all these intellectuals for tinned food. The hatred of many people for anything made of plastic. Like we had these plastic bag bans in California and elsewhere. Yeah, 2021 is going to be a year of zero hatred for Laponius. And like if you can make a good rational empirical case that plastic bags are bad for the environment, then okay, that's one thing, but much of the hatred for plastic bags just seemed non-rational. And we certainly see with the COVID-19 pandemic, we really need plastic bags in supermarkets. It's much less sanitary, much less safe to bring your own bags and reuse them time after time after time. So I've been thinking about how much of politics and how much of religion is just driven by personal dysfunction, right? If you have all these instincts, say you have instincts to hate anyone who's different, you're probably going to choose a politics on the right. And if you just have a instinctive hatred of all things female, right, you're probably very likely to choose a politics on the right. So we have instincts, and you can see by how someone keeps their room, they have a high conscientiousness instinct, probably going to be on the right politically. People are messy, they're probably going to be on the left politically. I had this girlfriend, and I remember how much disgust she had that I liked conventional popular music, such as the Eagles, Barry Manilow, Air Supply, REO Speedwagon, like Fleetwood Mac, these groups from the 80s. She thought it was just such poor taste. And it wasn't that she was making the argument for Beethoven or for Mozart, which I could understand. No, she couldn't make an argument for why the type of music I liked was bad. She just wanted me to get into this indie stuff. But it was indie pop music. There wasn't more sophisticated music. And so I wanted to hear her make an argument, like why these indie songs which have the same basic beat, the same basic 4/4 beat of popular music, why are they morally and culturally superior? And she couldn't do it. She just knew that her taste for indie music was inherently superior. So you see with these great intellectuals of the late 19th, early 20th century, they're unable to make a rational or empirical case for why the masses are stupid, bad, banal, dumb, idiotic, lack individuality. and they're unable to make the case for why their taste in art is superior. So it's interesting what they resort to. So both Friedrich Nietzsche and D.H. Lawrence had contempt for ideas, but they expressed their contempt for ideas in the form of ideas. It's like when I say all beliefs are just unnecessary muscular tension. Well, that's a belief, that all beliefs are just unnecessary muscular tension. So neither Nietzsche nor D.H. Lawrence could make their case rationally for their particular artistic tastes, and they couldn't make their case empirically, and they couldn't make their case logically. So what they resorted to was invoking God. So for many of these intellectuals who led secular and frequently hedonistic lives, the arbiter of what was great art and mediocre art was the divine presence. So God was in Shakespeare, God was in Goethe, God was not in the daily newspaper. And the stunning thing is, when you read Mein Kampf, that Hitler's views on art basically indistinguishable from the views of all the dominant modernist intellectuals of Britain and Europe at the end of the 19th, first 40 years of the 20th century. That they all regarded the masses as lacking individuality. Hitler regarded Russians as just completely incapable of individuality. They were just a mass. And a lot of negative consequences when you start viewing people as just a mass, just a dumb lump of humanity, just a bunch of bacteria. I remember having a really strongly negative opinion when a friend of mine about 3 months ago expressed the sentiment that people who live in cities, that they're useless, they're just stacked up like cordwood. So essentially all that they're good for is to be thrown into ovens. And have another friend whose his reaction when he reads about degeneracy in public policy and culture, his immediate reaction is, we need to build more ovens. And this thinking jars me. Like, I don't like the thinking that denies the humanity of other people. Now, I can understand it under stress. So in a run-up to an election, if you're fighting for your life, I can understand these sentiments a little more. But just you're reading the newspaper in the morning, you've got a nice home, you've got a nice life, you've got money in the bank, and your reaction when you read someone with very different politics from you is, we need to build more ovens. I find that disturbing. And I find it disturbing and repulsive when people think, anyone who lives in this geographic region, that they're essentially oven worthy. I don't like it. Just as I don't like the fairly widespread notion among some types of Christians that anyone who's not a Christian is essentially oven worthy, that they're just going to get burnt up in the fires of hell. At least these people are going to leave that burning for God. So that's the advantage with those Christians who believe anyone who's not in Christ is going to hell. They don't understand that burning hellfire is taking place in this world, but they leave it to God essentially in the next world. So there is some connection between the widespread Christian belief that the great mass of humanity are destined for eternally burning fire. And I know I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, and traditional Seventh-day Adventists hold that only 144,000 people are going to be saved. So the rest of the world's 6-7 billion population is just going to be burned up. So it seems like this is a very human tendency. We don't want to deal with the complexity of difference, and it's just so much easier that instead of thinking that there are 330 million people in the United States, they just like me with hopes and dreams, fears, vulnerabilities, but we just start dismissing them based on where they are geographically, or what their religious beliefs are, or what their political beliefs are. So I understand this human tendency to want to dismiss any thought of the humanity of most of the population from one's mind. But I'm not thrilled with it. I don't want to feed it either. So it's not a God of love then, with just 144,000 being saved. Yeah, what about the other 6 billion people on earth? So the good thing about the religious people who believe that is that they're leaving it to God, but I'm sure it does provoke kind of a callous attitude towards the vast majority of humanity who are not traditional Seventh-day Adventists. So my understanding of academic studies about who is righteous, who is ethical, less ethical, that religion tends to promote more ethical behavior within your in-group, but effectively there's no difference in the way religious people treat out-groups in the way that secular people treat out-groups. So that does kind of accord with my life experience. But I was stunned when I read this book, The Intellectuals and the Masses, that there's really no important difference in the worldview perspective on art between Hitler and that of the dominant English and European intelligentsia in the 50 years prior to World War II. The savage way that the intellectuals regarded the middle classes. That was also stunning to me. So just like my friend who essentially regards city dwellers as just useless firewood, but venerates essentially farmers and peasants. So that was the other interesting thing. I didn't realize how much veneration the leading intellectuals had for the peasant. I knew that Tolstoy venerated the peasants, but they venerated people who worked on farms and people who lived in the country and people who were peasants, and they had so much hatred and contempt for the middle class. And then varying attitudes towards the working class, but generally speaking, the dominant intellectuals in British Empire prior to World War II had professed positive feelings for the working class, mainly to show how good they were and how they were on the left. But they had contempt for the idea of the working class trying to read Shakespeare or trying to understand classical music. That somehow, unless you were born with a certain blood type, you just weren't going to be able to appreciate Beethoven or Mozart or Haydn. And I also had no idea the modernists like T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, George Moore, how much they were opposed to universal education. They thought essentially it was wasted, that teaching most people how to read and write, that our dominant intellectuals prior to World War II thought that this was a waste. And I was struck by the commonality between these widespread attitudes among intellectuals in the 50 years before World War II that are still with us today. So the intellectuals loathed mass newspapers. They thought they were vulgar, that they just appealed to the worst in people. And they loathed photography in particular, like Wyndham Lewis, who was like the intellectual's intellectual. He had utter contempt for photography. And he was so mad that his books didn't sell. So he went around with this huge grudge because his books didn't sell. And you just have to try to read them to quickly understand why his books didn't sell. But he thought that there was something wrong with humanity because they didn't want to buy his books. so I noticed for a lot of people on the alt-right or any kind of distant politics that they have contempt for the vast majority of the population because the population won't buy their art, not interested in their books or supporting their podcast. Yeah, so the book culminates with the chapters on Wyndham Lewis and Hitler. And Wyndham Lewis wrote 3 books against the Jews between about 1932 and 1940. He said they were complaining too much about Hitler. Hitler's reaction to them was essentially understandable. And I noticed that with Hitler and Lewis, and also a lot of alt-right intellectuals, they believe that the Jews control the media, and therefore the Jews control the thinking from their perspective, the dumb masses of people. And so one of the themes of my channel the past few months is that people did not develop to be gullible. Because I remember this as a child, trying to take advantage of some inmates of a mental asylum near where I lived. And I tried to trade them for their radio. And even though these people were inmates of an insane asylum, they knew better than to make a bad deal, essentially give away their radio to me. So people did not evolve to be gullible. People are not raw putty in the hands of the news media or advertising industry. So it was striking how much the intellectuals just loathe the advertising industry. So what possible benefits could come from an advertising industry? Well, advertising develops mass markets, which significantly reduce the cost of products. Once you can mass produce them, they're going to be a lot less expensive. So a lot of the intellectuals discussed the great mass of humanity, completely irrational, can't be supported by empirical or logical arguments. And so the intellectuals reacted to the growth of literacy and popular tastes by moving their art, moving their literature and their paintings away from that which could be accessed by normal people and away from normal human concerns such as love and fear and death and connection and disconnection and longing and repression, to just purely subjective standards of aesthetics, which really can only be validated by belief, well, God chose this type of art. So for many of these intellectuals, God exists primarily just to make artistic judgments. So when they can't empirically make a strong argument for why the type of art that they prefer is superior to the type of art preferred by the middle class, they resort to saying, well, God is in the art that I prefer. That God occupies himself with making artistic judgments. It just so happens that God's judgments about art and my judgments about art just so happen to coincide, which is a pretty weak argument. Right? You try to argue that your tastes are validated by reference to, an unknowable divine being who just so happens to prefer the art that you prefer. I was also struck by all the gratuitous hatred of women that these intellectuals in the 50 years prior to World War II, they saw the great mass of humanity as essentially being feminine in the sense of being passive and weak-minded and easily manipulated and needing a strong man to come along and tell them what to do. And so once again, there's no difference here between Hitler's point of view, between Wyndham Lewis's point of view, H.G. Wells's point of view, and the other intellectuals talked about in John Kerry's magnificent book, The Intellectuals and the Masses, British Intelligentsia from 1880 to 1939. It's also interesting to learn about Wyndham Lewis's politics. It was essentially just justifications for his impulses. So he had a great deal of problems reconciling desires of his body with the artistic ideals in his head. So it's kind of usually more of a juvenile thing, and that once people become adults, they kind of make peace with the desires and needs of the body. But what was also striking about the intellectuals is how much loathing they had for children. So Wyndham Lewis repeatedly got rid of his children into orphanages. How often these intellectuals married women who were far below them in social class so that they could bully them, so that they could find women who would just do what they said because they didn't want to be challenged. And largely an absence of happily married people with children among these elite intellectuals. And it was striking that pretty much all their views were in line with Mein Kampf. That how easily these intellectuals would talk about wiping out the vast majority of humanity. So the vast majority of humanity didn't have an individuality, didn't have sensitivities, they didn't have feelings, they didn't love, they didn't have yearnings, desires, taste, sensitivity. That this was solely the domain of these intellectuals. So hatred to protect the things you love, okay, I get that. But hatred simply to protect your social standing, your unique status as an intellectual, hatred against your own people, your own kind, that just seems pathological and dysfunctional. And so I think that a religious point of view would probably militate against this gratuitous nastiness, right? As a religious person, as a religious Jew or Christian, you understand that everybody possesses the image of God, that other people are just as real as you are. Now, you can definitely take this too far. So you may think, well, fear and hatred, usually what's underneath hatred is fear. So I was talking to this Sheila the other day, and she referred to herself as having foot and mouth disease. And that's something that I suffered with for many decades, foot and mouth disease. So I was talking to a friend about that, who's also suffered from foot and mouth disease, of saying the wrong thing, the wrong time to the wrong people. And I tried to figure out where it came from. And he decided that it was largely a product of anxiety. That when you're anxious, you want to get rid of your anxiety. And so to get rid of your anxiety, you say stupid, gratuitous things, which often turn out to be inappropriate. So I notice I make much better decisions in what I say and do if I'm calm. But if I'm agitated, anxious, nervous, filled with fear, I don't see reality nearly as clearly, and much more likely to blurt out the wrong thing. Like, why do people get foot and mouth disease? Why do some people consistently say the wrong thing at the wrong times, the wrong people? Because the anxiety that they feel, the self-loathing, self-hatred, the fear, so great that they must get rid of it. They must dispel it. And so they just blurt out something. So I remember talking to someone the other day, and came up that I'd converted to Judaism, and her immediate response was, "Oh, you must hate Christ." Well, my conversion to Judaism actually had nothing to do with Jesus. I left Christianity for several years before I became interested in Judaism. But it's just kind of a bizarre thing to say that if someone converts to a religion, it's because necessarily they must hate your religion. Or if I unfollow someone on Facebook, it must mean that I have some negative feelings about them, right? If I eat porridge every morning for a month and then decide I want a different breakfast, I just want to drink a liter of kefir for breakfast, doesn't mean I hate porridge, it just means I want to change. If I start every day reading the New York Times, then one morning I wake up and decide, I want to read ESPN about the sporting event last night, doesn't mean I hate the New York Times, it just means that I want to change. That sometimes we desire to go in a different way. So on the one hand, we do have a profound influence on other people. Sometimes we have a profound influence. Sometimes we have a mild influence. Sometimes we have zero, zilch, no influence on other people. But even if we do have some influence on someone, it's no sure thing that their choices are a result of us or a reaction to us. So I notice a lot of anxious, insecure people, they take things very personally. If someone doesn't return their call promptly or return their email, or doesn't want to meet them for dinner, that must have something to do with I offended the person, or that person's overly sensitive, or that person's a cuck or a loser, and we don't get to know fully what goes on with other people. Sometimes we can only guess, sometimes we don't have a clue. So the way that intellectuals would regard the great mass of humanity with such utter contempt reminds me of the way that many people on the right, on the left, behave on social media, like ascribing motivations to people that they don't really know. When we can barely understand our own motivations, it just seems useless to me to start making hateful arguments based on your suppositions about other people's motivations. And then this notion of, our elites hate us and want us dead. Again, it just seems totally useless. It must come out of anxiety, which is underlain by fear, that the world as you know it is crumbling around you. And so the easiest explanation is that there's a malevolent, tiny group of people who are pulling the strings, because the great mass of humanity, they're just useless. They have no individuality. But there's a malevolent group that's pulling the strings, and the great lumpen mass of people are just going along with what this dastardly elite decides. So I guess it's a way to come up with an explanation to deal with your fear and anger about the world around you. So one common response to an inability to process fear and anger is to become apathetic. And another common response is to delve into conspiracy theories. But perhaps a common denominator on all these non-functional responses is to deny the reality of other people, other groups, outside groups, out groups. And this is tricky because there is some utility having an in-group preference, right? It'd be weird if you did not put the welfare of your own family first. It'd be weird if you did not put the interests of your own community ahead of some community on the other side of the world. It'd be weird if you didn't identify more with your religious group than with an out group. But all sorts of coping strategies that work at one level then become dysfunctional when they become too intense, and that they just become avenues for gratuitous, destructive hatred. So I'm just starting to see these themes a little more clearly now. How it makes a lot of people just anxious to understand that other people are as real as them. So how eager people are to dismiss the humanity of those who are different. Yeah, The Intellectuals and the Masses. Great book by John Kerry. And it's hard to find any significant differences between the views on art as espoused by Adolf Hitler and the views on art as espoused by the leading modernist intellectuals prior to World War II. I'm not in the ghetto, bro. I'm in the slums of Beverly Hills. So you're looking at Beverly Hills right now, but it is the slums of Beverly Hills. So I commend to you the retired Oxford professor of English literature, literary critic, John Kerry. Comes from a working class or lower middle class background. Got a scholarship to Oxford. Got his doctorate of philosophy. Had a long distinguished career in English literature, and wrote a very thought-provoking book, The Intellectuals and the Masses.